Welcome, my friends, to another chilling episode of Mr. Dark. Tonight, I have a tale that will crawl under your skin and linger in your thoughts long after the lights go out. It's a story of guilt, revenge, and a spirit that refused to rest. A group of college friends thought they were playing a harmless prank, but what they unleashed was far from harmless and far from human. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? When a haunting is not just a ghost story, but a reckoning? Turn off the lights, sit back, and let me take you into the chilling depths of the haunting of Hollow Ridge. This is the story of Megan. It was a cold fall night in Ashland, a quiet college town nestled in Oregon. 5 students, all close friends, shared a dormitory room at Hollow Ridge College. They were inseparable, bound not only by their classes, but by the relentless pranks they played on each other. But one prank would change everything. Among these friends was Claire, a shy, introverted girl who always found herself at the center of their jokes. The others, Derek, Emily, Sam, and Olivia, had a strange affection for teasing her. Claire was quiet, rarely standing up for herself, and that made her an easy target. The pranks had started harmlessly enough, but soon they took a darker turn. It all began with a scream. Late one night, just past 2 a.m., the dorm's tranquility shattered when Claire's piercing shriek echoed through the halls. Olivia, her roommate, shot out of bed, heart pounding, and rushed to Claire's side. The door to their small room burst open, and the others, along with the dorm supervisor, Ms. Davis, hurried inside. "What happened?" Emily asked, eyes wide. Claire was trembling, curled up on her bed. She was here. She said she was coming for me. She said she'd take me away." Claire's voice cracked with fear, her hands gripping the edge of her blanket like a lifeline. "Who are you talking about?" Derek asked, half amused. Claire's breath hitched as she uttered the name that sent chills through the room. "Megan." The room fell silent. No one spoke, their faces shadowed by disbelief and a touch of unease. Megan had died almost a month ago. Her heart had failed in the middle of the night, a tragic and sudden death that had left everyone in shock. There had been rumors Megan was disturbed before she died, but no one paid much attention. "Claire, that's impossible." Ms. Davis finally broke the silence. "Megan is gone. You know that. No one's here to take you anywhere." Claire's wide eyes remained locked on the far corner of the room, as if still seeing the apparition. "She's not gone. I saw her. She was right here, and she said she's coming for me." Ms. Davis frowned, glancing at the other students. Olivia chimed in. "She's just scared. Megan was her best friend, and maybe that's why she thinks she's seeing her." The room eventually cleared out. Ms. Davis reassured Claire and left, telling Olivia to keep an eye on her. But Claire's words lingered like a cold mist. Olivia rolled her eyes, trying to hide her nerves. "Honestly, Claire, you almost blew everything. Just let it go," Olivia whispered harshly, pulling the blanket back over herself. "It was just an accident. How were we supposed to know Megan would freak out like that?" Claire sat silently, hugging her knees, unable to sleep. Every creak of the old dorm made her jump. The darkness around her felt heavier than ever, and the faint rustle of leaves outside seemed to carry whispers from beyond. Suddenly, Claire heard it, a soft, barely audible voice, calling her name. "Claire, Claire." She froze, heart hammering in her chest. The voice came again, closer now, as if someone was standing right beside her bed. Her breath hitched as she slowly turned her head, praying she was imagining it. But the voice grew louder. "Claire, you can't escape me." Terror seized her, and she clutched the covers tighter, trying to block out the sound. But no matter how hard she pressed her hands against her ears, the voice echoed within her mind. Her chest tightened with panic, and before she could stop herself, Claire screamed. Olivia jerked awake, exasperated, "For God's sake, Claire, enough already," she snapped. Olivia stormed out of bed, flicking on the light. "You've got to stop this drama, seriously. You're hearing things because you can't let go of Megan. Just forget about it." Claire didn't respond, her eyes wide with terror, but Olivia just sighed, dismissing her as paranoid. She turned off the light, muttering something under her breath, and went back to sleep. Claire, however, couldn't close her eyes. The weight of the unseen terror pressed down on her, making every second feel like an eternity. Hours passed, and the dormitory lay in eerie silence. Claire remained awake, staring into the pitch-black room. Just as she began to think the worst was over, the whispers returned. Louder, sharper this time. A shadow moved across the wall. Claire's pulse quickened as she watched the shadow glide across the wall. It moved slowly at first, an indistinct silhouette, barely noticeable in the dark. But then it grew larger, taking on the shape of something human, something familiar. Claire's throat tightened, her breath shallow as the shadow loomed nearer. It was unmistakably Megan. Her outline was faint at first, just a blur against the wall. But as Claire stared, the figure seemed to solidify, as if stepping out from some unseen realm. Claire wanted to scream, but her voice refused to cooperate. Her body remained paralyzed with terror. "Megan?" Claire whispered, barely audible. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it lingered near the window, its head slightly tilted, as though observing Claire, judging her. Claire clutched her bedsheets tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had hoped that Olivia was right, that it was all just a trick of her tired mind, some manifestation of guilt and fear. But this was real. This wasn't her imagination. Megan was here, and she wasn't at peace. A sudden cold draft swept through the room, sending a chill down Claire's spine. She could feel Megan's presence now, stronger than ever, as though she was standing right next to her, watching, waiting. Claire's breath quickened. "Megan, I'm sorry. We didn't know," Claire whimpered, barely able to speak through the tightness in her throat. The shadow moved closer, its figure bending unnaturally as it seemed to crawl along the wall. Claire could feel the weight of the air shifting around her, pressing down, suffocating her. The whispers came again, this time directly in her ear. "You let me die. You laughed." "No," Claire gasped, her heart racing. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." The shadow stopped, and for a moment the room fell deathly silent. Claire dared not move, too afraid of what Megan's ghost would do next. But then, with a sudden rush of wind, the shadow darted across the room, straight at Claire. She screamed, jerking back so hard she nearly fell off the bed. Olivia sat bolt upright, her patience completely frayed. "Jesus, Claire, what is wrong with you?" she snapped, flipping the light switch again. "This has to stop." Claire pointed at the wall, her entire body shaking. "Megan. Megan was right there. She spoke to me. She said—" "She's dead, Claire," Olivia interrupted harshly. "Do you hear yourself? She's gone. There's no one here but us." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she collapsed back against the headboard, clutching her chest. She felt as though her heart might explode from the terror. Olivia didn't seem to care. Olivia glared at her, shaking her head. "You need help. This whole thing is in your head. We can't keep doing this, Claire. We've all had enough." Without another word, Olivia turned off the light and slammed herself back onto her bed, leaving Claire trembling in the dark. But Claire knew what she had seen. She wasn't crazy. Megan had come back, and she was furious. The next morning, the friends gathered in the college cafeteria. Olivia, Sam, Derek, and Emily sat together at their usual table, but Claire wasn't with them. She hadn't come out of the dorm all morning, still shaken from the night before. "Did she sleep at all?" Derek asked, shoveling scrambled eggs into his mouth. Olivia shrugged, looking exhausted. "No, she's losing it. Kept saying she saw Megan last night. Like, what the hell is wrong with her?" Emily frowned, stirring her coffee. Maybe we went too far, Liv. Claire wasn't exactly stable before all this, and now... Olivia rolled her eyes. Come on, we didn't do anything that bad. It's just a prank. Claire's the one who's making this weird. Sam, who had been quiet so far, finally spoke up. But what if she's right? What if she really saw something? Olivia looked at him like he'd just suggested the earth was flat. Are you serious? Megan's dead, Sam. Whatever Claire thinks she's seeing, it's not real. She's just freaked out and she's projecting her guilt. Derek chimed in, trying to lighten the mood. Claire just needs to chill. She's always been sensitive, you know. Like she overthinks everything. Emily wasn't convinced, though. But what if she's not overthinking? What if Megan really is, I don't know, haunting us? Olivia slammed her cup down on the table. Jesus, Em, don't start with that ghost crap. Megan's gone. End of story. Back at the dorm, Claire sat on her bed, pale and shivering despite the warm afternoon sun pouring through the window. She hadn't been able to eat, her stomach knotted with fear. The memory of the shadow, of Megan's voice, echoed endlessly in her mind. No matter how much she tried to shake it, the feeling wouldn't go away. The feeling that Megan was still with her, watching from the corners of the room, waiting for the right moment to strike. She needed to do something, anything, to stop this. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone and called her mother. But the line went to voicemail. Claire hung up, feeling utterly alone. As her anxiety mounted, the room seemed to darken around her, shadows creeping in from the corners, growing larger and more menacing. Her phone buzzed suddenly, and she jumped, nearly dropping it. The message was from an unknown number. "You can't run from me, Claire. I'm coming for you." Claire's heart stopped. Her vision blurred as panic surged through her. It couldn't be Megan. Megan was dead. Then why was she getting these messages? Why did she hear Megan's voice in her mind every time she closed her eyes? Her phone buzzed again, and this time a picture flashed on the screen. A blurry, dark image of the dorm hallway. It was taken from right outside her door. Claire's fingers trembled as she stared at her phone. The blurry image of the hallway burned into her mind. Someone, something, was right outside her door. Her breath came in short gasps, her chest tight with dread. Every rational part of her brain screamed that it wasn't possible, that it was a prank or some sick joke. But deep down, she knew the truth. Megan was here. Slowly, Claire rose from her bed, each movement filled with trepidation. She tiptoed to the door, her body stiff with fear. The door loomed large in front of her, and with each step, the cold sensation of dread curled around her spine. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. With a shaking hand, she gripped the doorknob. The cold metal felt like ice beneath her skin, sending a chill up her arm. She hesitated, pressing her ear against the door, straining to hear anything on the other side. Footsteps, whispers, anything. But there was only silence. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open just a crack. The hallway was dimly lit, the lights flickering faintly as though struggling to stay on. Nothing moved. The door to Olivia's room at the far end of the hall was closed, and all seemed still. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She peeked through the gap in the door, her eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. For a moment, she thought she was alone, but then she saw it. A shadow at the far end of the hallway. It was barely noticeable, just a smudge of darkness against the flickering lights. But Claire could feel it watching her. Her pulse quickened as she stepped back, closing the door quietly. She locked it and backed away, heart racing. There was no mistaking it. Megan was there, waiting for her, and this time there was no escape. Claire backed up to her bed, her knees giving out as she collapsed onto the mattress. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt frozen, locked in place by the paralyzing grip of terror. Her phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see whatever message had come next. But her curiosity won out. She grabbed the phone and swiped the screen. It was another text from the unknown number. "Why did you leave me?" Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she stared at the message. She couldn't breathe. Her mind was spinning, heart pounding painfully in her chest. She had no answer. She had never meant to hurt Megan, but the guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder that the prank had gone too far. Megan had died because of it. And now her ghost had returned to collect on that debt. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, casting the room into brief pockets of darkness. Claire looked up, her heart in her throat. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, growing longer, darker, as if something unseen was lurking within them. Her entire body tensed, waiting for the inevitable. Then she heard it, a soft knock at the door. Her blood ran cold. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Claire's mouth went dry as she stared at the door, unable to move. "Claire, open the door," a voice whispered through the wood. It was Megan's voice, unmistakable. "No," Claire whimpered, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. "You're not real. You're not real." But the voice persisted, soft and deadly. "I'm coming for you. You can't hide from me forever." The knocking stopped, replaced by the slow, deliberate creaking of the doorknob turning. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she watched the knob twist, the lock rattling under the pressure. The door remained closed, but the knob continued to turn, as though someone, or something, on the other side was trying to force their way in. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from outside her window, making Claire jump. She whipped her head toward the sound, her eyes wide with fear. Outside, through the frosted glass, she could see a figure standing just beyond the window frame. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Claire stumbled toward the window, trying to see through the foggy glass. The figure was barely visible, obscured by the frost and the dim lighting outside, but she knew it was Megan. She could feel her presence, cold, malicious, and unrelenting. Without warning, the figure pressed its face against the glass. Claire gasped, stumbling back as the ghostly face of Megan appeared before her, pale, expressionless, her eyes empty and lifeless. She stared at Claire with hollow, vacant eyes, her lips curling into a twisted smile. Claire screamed, backing away from the window, her mind racing with panic. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She turned and ran toward the door, flinging it open in desperation. She bolted into the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor as she ran. She needed to find Olivia, Sam, anyone. Someone had to help her. But as she sprinted down the hallway, her steps echoed eerily, the flickering lights above her casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Finally, she reached Olivia's door and pounded on it, her fists trembling as she banged frantically. "Olivia, please let me in. She's here. Megan's here." After what felt like an eternity, the door opened and Olivia stood there, her face twisted in annoyance. "Claire, what the hell?" "She's outside. I saw her. She's trying to get in. We have to go. We have to get out of here." Claire's words came out in a frantic rush, her voice nearly breaking. Olivia's expression softened slightly, but she still looked skeptical. "Claire, there's no one outside. You need to calm down. You're losing it." "No, she's out there, Olivia. She's not gone. Megan's still here." Claire sobbed, her voice thick with terror. But Olivia just sighed, rubbing her eyes. "You need to stop. Megan is dead, Claire. Dead. And you're driving yourself crazy with this." Claire shook her head, stepping back. No, she's real. She's here." Before Olivia could say anything else, there was a sharp knock on the door behind them. The knock was deliberate, slow, and terrifyingly familiar. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her body going rigid as the knock came again, louder this time. Both of them turned to face the door. "Olivia," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. For the first time, Claire saw a flicker of fear in Olivia's eyes. The knock on the door echoed through the dormitory hallway like a slow, deliberate drumbeat, each sound more ominous than the last. Claire's heart raced as she stared at the door, knowing what awaited them on the other side. Megan. Olivia, who had been dismissive until now, finally seemed shaken. She stood frozen, her hand gripping the doorknob but unable to open it. Another knock, louder, more insistent this time. Claire backed away, her breathing rapid, chest tight. "Olivia, don't open it. Please, whatever you do, don't open that door," she whispered, her voice trembling. Olivia's eyes darted between Claire and the door. She had been so sure that Claire was just losing her mind, but now, standing there in the dim hallway with the slow, persistent knocking, doubt crept into her thoughts. What if Claire wasn't imagining it? What if Megan really was there, just on the other side? The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The tension between the two girls hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive. Claire could feel her pulse in her ears, the beat of her heart nearly drowning out the quiet. Then, from the other side of the door, they both heard a voice. A soft, chilling whisper that sent a wave of ice down their spines. "Let me in." It was Megan's voice. Olivia's grip tightened on the doorknob, but she hesitated, glancing at Claire, whose wide, tear-filled eyes pleaded with her not to move. "Olivia, don't... please," Claire whispered, barely able to speak through the terror constricting her throat. The door rattled slightly as if someone or something was trying to force it open. The rattling grew more violent, and Olivia, finally understanding the gravity of the situation, let go of the knob and backed away from the door, her face pale. "What do we do?" Olivia muttered, her voice barely audible. The bravado and skepticism she had shown earlier were gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. Before Claire could answer, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. A cold wind seemed to sweep through the dorm, though no windows were open. The lights above them flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls that danced and twisted like figures from another world. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and the door to Olivia's room flew open with a violent crash. Both girls screamed, stumbling backward, but the hallway beyond was empty. The door had opened on its own. No one was there, or so it seemed. Olivia was the first to recover, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "This can't be happening. This isn't real," she mumbled to herself, gripping her hair as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. But Claire knew better. This was real, and it was happening. Megan was no longer just a memory or a guilty conscience. She was here, and she was angry. "We have to leave," Claire said, grabbing Olivia's arm. "We can't stay here." Olivia didn't argue this time. She nodded, still shaking, and the two of them bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. They ran through the winding corridors of the dormitory, their footsteps echoing against the cold, hard floor. The entire building seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, as if the walls themselves were alive and watching them. They burst out the back door of the dormitory into the chilly night air. The cool breeze hit their faces, but it brought no comfort. Claire's hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she could barely catch her breath. Olivia leaned against the wall, her legs trembling as the adrenaline coursed through her veins. "What the hell was that?" Olivia gasped, her voice laced with panic. "How is this possible? She's dead, Claire. She's dead." "I told you," Claire said, trying to steady her breathing. "I told you she wasn't gone. She's still here. She never left." For the first time, Olivia seemed to truly believe her. She glanced back at the dormitory door, still wide open, the dim light from inside casting a long, haunting shadow across the yard. "We have to go back for the others," Olivia said after a long pause. "Derek, Sam, Emily. They don't know." Claire's stomach dropped. The others were still inside, unaware of the danger. But going back inside felt like walking into the lion's den. Megan's presence was everywhere in that building, and now, with her growing power, no one was safe. "We can't just leave them," Olivia insisted, her voice rising with urgency. "We need to tell them what's going on. They won't believe us, but we have to try." Claire nodded, though every fibre of her being screamed at her to stay away from the dormitory. She knew Olivia was right. Derek, Sam and Emily were still inside, and they needed to know the truth. If they stayed in the dorm, Megan would come for them too, just like she had come for Claire. "Okay," Claire said quietly, "but we need to be careful. She's everywhere. She's watching us." The two girls steeled themselves and made their way back toward the dormitory. The air around them felt thick with tension, the night unnaturally still. As they approached the building, they both stopped in their tracks. From inside the dorm they could hear something, faint but unmistakable. Laughter. Not the joyful, light-hearted kind. No, this was different. Dark, distorted, as though it came from a place of pain and malice. It echoed through the halls of the building, chilling them to their core. Olivia's eyes widened. "That's her," she whispered. "That's Megan." Claire nodded, her throat dry. The laugh grew louder, filling the empty air around them with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was coming from somewhere deep within the building, from a place that neither of them could reach or escape. "She's playing with us," Claire muttered. "She's trying to scare us, to break us." But they couldn't stop. They had to warn the others before it was too late. Claire and Olivia slipped back inside the dormitory, the heavy wooden door creaking as it closed behind them. The hallway was dark and foreboding, the flickering lights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as they moved. As they crept through the halls, they noticed something strange. An unnatural chill had settled over the entire building. Frost clung to the windows, despite the moderate autumn weather outside. The air felt heavy, thick with an otherworldly presence. "We need to find them," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Before she does." They moved quickly but cautiously, making their way down the long corridors toward the rooms where Derek, Sam and Emily were likely still sleeping, unaware of the terror that lurked within the walls of the dormitory. But as they turned the corner to reach Derek's room, they froze. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and a thin sliver of light leaked out into the dark hallway. "Derek," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response, only silence. The sliver of light spilling from Derek's slightly open door seemed to pulse with a life of its own, casting jagged shadows on the hallway walls. Claire and Olivia stood frozen, staring at the door. Their breaths came in shallow gasps as they tried to make sense of the unnatural stillness that now surrounded them. The eerie laughter that had echoed through the dormitory moments before had stopped abruptly, leaving only an oppressive, crushing silence in its wake. "Derek?" Claire whispered again, her voice trembling. She took a tentative step toward the door, her legs feeling as though they might give out beneath her at any moment. Olivia stayed close behind her, her eyes darting nervously up and down the hallway. They reached the door, Claire's hand hovering over the knob. Her pulse quickened, her skin crawling with the sensation that something terrible was waiting on the other side. She shot a glance at Olivia, whose face was pale with fear, but Olivia nodded, an unspoken signal that they had no choice but to move forward. With a deep breath, Claire pushed the door open slowly, the old wood creaking as the door swung inward. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single bedside lamp. At first glance, everything looked normal. Derek's bed was unmade, his clothes strewn across the floor. His desk was cluttered with papers, his laptop still open, casting a faint blue glow. But Derek was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Olivia whispered, stepping into the room behind Claire. She glanced nervously around, her body tense as if expecting something to leap out at them. Claire's eyes darted around the room, her heart thudding in her chest. Maybe he went to the bathroom or something. But Claire didn't believe her own words. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy, thick and suffocating, as if it were pressing down on them from all sides. The chill that had seeped into the dormitory now seemed to cling to them like a second skin, making it difficult to breathe. Claire's gaze fell on the closet door at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, just like the door to the hallway. Her stomach twisted with unease as she stared at the dark gap between the door and the frame. Something about it felt off, as if it were beckoning her to come closer. "Olivia," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. She pointed toward the closet. "What if he's in there?" Olivia swallowed hard, her eyes wide with fear. "You think—" Claire didn't want to think about it. She didn't want to imagine what might be hiding in that closet. But they had to know. Slowly they moved across the room, their footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet space. Every nerve in Claire's body screamed at her to stop, to turn around and run, but she couldn't. Reaching the closet door, Claire hesitated. Her hand hovered just above the knob, her fingers trembling. The cold air seeping from the crack in the door felt like a living thing, winding its way around her wrist, pulling her closer. She could feel Olivia standing tense behind her, the air between them charged with fear. With a deep breath, Claire grabbed the knob and yanked the door open. The closet was empty. Both girls let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. For a brief moment, relief washed over them. But that relief was short-lived. Just as Claire turned to face Olivia, she noticed something strange. There were handprints on the inside of the closet door, dark, smudged prints, as though someone had pressed their hands against the wood from the inside. The marks trailed down the door, as if whoever had made them had been pulled downward, dragged into the dark. "Olivia," Claire breathed, stepping back. "Look!" Olivia's eyes widened in horror as she saw the handprints. "Oh my God!" Before they could say another word, the lights in the room flickered violently. The temperature dropped even further, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the room. Though there were no windows open, the door to the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang, making both girls jump. Claire's heart raced, her mind spinning with panic. "She's here!" The words had barely left her lips when they heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You can't run from me!" It was Megan's voice. The whisper grew louder, filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating energy. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer and darker, twisting and contorting as though alive. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside the room. Claire and Olivia both jumped, their eyes darting to the door. Someone, or something, was out there. The door rattled violently as though being struck from the other side, the handle twisting back and forth. "We have to go," Claire gasped, grabbing Olivia's arm. "We have to get out of here." But Olivia was frozen in place, her wide eyes locked on the door as it continued to rattle and shake. "What if it's Derek?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Claire shook her head, her fear rising. "It's not him. We have to go now." Without waiting for Olivia's response, Claire bolted toward the door. She reached for the handle, but just as her fingers touched the cold metal, the door flew open, throwing her backward. She landed hard on the floor, her head spinning from the impact. Through her dazed vision, Claire saw something standing in the doorway. It was a figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in darkness. Its face was pale and twisted, its eyes empty and lifeless. A chill ran down Claire's spine as she realized who it was. Megan. Olivia let out a strangled gasp as she backed away, her hand over her mouth. This isn't possible, she whispered, her voice shaking. Megan stood in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire, her lips curled into a cruel, unnatural smile as she took a step forward. "You thought you could forget me, didn't you?" Megan's voice was low, menacing. "You thought you could run." Claire scrambled to her feet, backing away as fast as she could. "It was an accident," she cried. "We didn't mean for this to happen." Megan's smile widened, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth or humanity. "It's too late for apologies, Claire." Without another word, Megan lunged forward, her arms outstretched, reaching for Claire with cold, bony fingers. Claire screamed, grabbing Olivia's hand, and they both bolted from the room. They ran down the hallway, the walls seeming to close in on them as Megan's laughter echoed behind them, growing louder, more twisted. But no matter how fast they ran, they could feel Megan's presence chasing them, always just a few steps behind, her cold breath on their necks. Claire and Olivia ran through the twisting dormitory hallways, their footsteps echoing off the walls as if they were the only sound in the world. Behind them, Megan's twisted laughter followed like a shadow, growing louder with each passing second. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her lungs burning as they sprinted. But no matter how fast they ran, Megan's presence seemed to be closing in on them. "Faster!" Claire shouted, glancing over her shoulder. The hallway behind them seemed to stretch endlessly, warping and distorting in the flickering light. And there, in the distance, Claire could see her, a dark, gaunt figure gliding effortlessly down the corridor, her pale face twisted into that cruel smile. Megan. Olivia's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to keep up, her legs heavy with exhaustion. We can't outrun her!" Olivia gasped, terror in her voice, but Claire refused to stop. "We have to try." They rounded a corner, their feet slipping on the slick floor, and found themselves at a dead end, a narrow, windowless corridor with a single door at the far end. Claire skidded to a halt, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to Olivia, panic etched into every line of her face. "This way!" Claire yanked Olivia by the arm, and they bolted toward the door. Claire reached it first, throwing herself against the cold metal handle, hoping, praying it would open. With a loud creak, the door gave way, revealing a narrow, concrete staircase leading downward into darkness. "No," Olivia whispered, her voice quivering. "We can't go down there." Claire didn't hesitate. "It's our only chance." Grabbing Olivia's hand, Claire pulled her through the doorway and slammed the door shut behind them. The stairwell was cold, damp, and suffocating, with no lights to guide them. The only source of light was the faint flickering coming from the floor above, filtering through the cracks around the door. For a moment, everything was still. The pounding of their hearts echoed in the confined space, their breaths shallow and desperate. They leaned against the wall, trying to gather their thoughts. But then, from the other side of the door, they heard it, a slow, deliberate knock. It was soft at first, barely audible. Then came another knock, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. "She's coming," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Olivia clutched Claire's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Where do we go? We can't stay here." Claire's mind raced, trying to think of an escape, but the stairwell led only down into the basement, dark and uncharted territory. "We have to hide. There's nowhere else." Without waiting for a response, Claire pulled Olivia down the stairs. They stumbled in the darkness, their hands gripping the cold, rusted railing as they descended deeper into the bowels of the building. The damp air grew colder with each step, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them like a heavy weight. At the bottom of the staircase, they reached a small, musty basement hallway. The faint scent of mildew hung in the air, and the walls were lined with old pipes that groaned and hissed, as though the building itself was alive. A single flickering bulb illuminated the corridor, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance with every flicker. "We need to find a place to hide," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Olivia nodded, still gripping Claire's arm as they made their way through the basement. The narrow hallway twisted and turned, the air growing thicker and more oppressive. They passed old storage rooms, their doors half rotted and hanging off their hinges. Claire glanced inside one of the rooms and saw nothing but dust and abandoned junk, no place to hide. Just as they reached the end of the hallway, they found a small metal door marked Boiler Room. Claire turned the handle, and to her relief, it opened with a creak. They slipped inside, shutting the door quietly behind them. The boiler room was cramped and cluttered, filled with old, rusted machinery that hissed and clanged intermittently. A single overhead light buzzed faintly, casting dim shadows over the rows of pipes and boilers that lined the room. Claire and Olivia crouched behind one of the large boilers, pressing themselves into the corner as tightly as they could. They sat in silence, their backs pressed against the cold metal, their bodies trembling with fear. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, and every creak and groan of the old machinery sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her. Olivia leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think she'll find us?" "I don't know," Claire admitted, her voice cracking with fear. "But we have to stay quiet. Maybe she won't come down here." The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The faint sounds of the building settling, the rhythmic hiss of the boiler, and their shallow breathing were the only noises that broke the suffocating silence. Then, faintly at first, they heard it. A soft, distant whisper. Claire stiffened, her body going rigid as the voice grew louder, more distinct. It was Megan. "You can't hide from me, Claire. You can't escape." The voice echoed through the basement, curling around them like a cold wind. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Claire bit her lip, fighting back the urge to scream. How was this possible? How had Megan found them? Suddenly, there was a loud clang as something struck one of the pipes in the hallway outside the boiler room. The sound reverberated through the room, and both girls jumped, their hearts racing. Claire covered her mouth with her hand, trying to muffle her rapid breathing. The door to the boiler room creaked open slowly. Claire's blood ran cold as she stared at the door from behind the boiler, watching in horror as it swung inward. The dim light from the hallway spilled into the room, casting long shadows over the machinery. Footsteps echoed softly on the concrete floor, deliberate and measured, like the footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were hiding. Olivia let out a soft sob, pressing herself further into the corner, but Claire held her arm tightly, shaking her head in warning. They had to stay quiet. They had to stay still. The footsteps stopped. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she saw a shadow moving along the wall, inching closer and closer to where they were hiding. The air grew colder, the oppressive presence of Megan filling the room. A voice, soft and sinister, drifted through the air. "I see you." Claire's heart pounded so loudly, she was sure it would give them away. She closed her eyes, willing herself to disappear, to vanish into the darkness. But the cold presence drew nearer. The shadow moved over the boiler, long and distorted, as if something otherworldly was standing right behind them. Suddenly the lights in the room flickered violently, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room was plunged into complete darkness, the only sound now the rapid beating of their hearts. For a moment neither of them moved, too afraid to even breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, The oppressive presence vanished. Claire and Olivia sat frozen in the pitch-black boiler room, their bodies pressed tightly against the cold metal of the machinery. The sudden silence was deafening, each second dragging on as if time had slowed to a crawl. The only sounds were their shallow breaths, quick and erratic, and the faint, far-off hum of the machinery in the basement. Had Megan left? Claire strained her ears, listening for any hint of movement, any sign that the terrifying presence of their former friend still lurked nearby. But there was nothing, only the cold, oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow them whole. "I think she's gone," Claire whispered, barely able to hear her own voice. Her breath came in sharp, quick bursts, her body still trembling with fear. Olivia didn't respond at first. Her head was buried in her arms, her whole body curled up in the tight space between the boiler and the wall, as though she could make herself small enough to disappear. After a long pause, she slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide with terror. "Are you sure?" Claire swallowed hard, the taste of fear thick on her tongue. "I don't know." Her voice wavered, and despite her attempt to sound confident, she felt no relief. The darkness around them felt alive, as if it were watching, waiting. They stayed huddled in the cramped space for what felt like hours, their senses on high alert for any sound, any shift in the air that might signal Megan's return. But the minutes ticked by, and the basement remained eerily quiet. Finally, Claire gathered the courage to speak again. "We can't stay here forever." Olivia shook her head slowly. "Where do we go? There's no way out." Claire's mind raced, her thoughts clouded by exhaustion and panic. She knew Olivia was right. They had trapped themselves in the basement, and there was only one way out, the way they had come in. But to go back upstairs meant facing Megan again. "I don't know," Claire admitted. "But we can't just sit here and wait for her to find us. We have to do something." A soft, hesitant knock echoed through the boiler room, sending a fresh wave of terror down their spines. Both girls tensed, their eyes darting toward the door. The knock was gentle, almost polite, but it carried with it the same unmistakable dread that had haunted them since the night began. "I'm still here," the voice said, soft and menacing. "You can't hide from me." Claire's stomach lurched. She recognized that voice. It was Megan, closer than ever, as though she was standing just outside the door. Olivia's breath hitched as she squeezed Claire's arm, her nails digging into her skin. "We're trapped, Claire," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. "She's going to kill us." "No," Claire said, though she had no idea how they could escape. Her thoughts were racing, but her mind kept returning to the same horrific realization. They couldn't run from Megan. She was no longer a person, no longer confined to the rules of the living. She was everywhere. The light overhead flickered again, casting the room into brief moments of total darkness. Each flicker seemed to pull the air from Claire's lungs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might explode. They couldn't see her, but Megan was close, too close. Then, as suddenly as the knock had come, there was silence. The boiler room returned to its oppressive, still state, the only sound now the faint hum of the old machinery. Claire felt the tension in the air lessen, just for a moment, as though whatever force had been lurking was gone again. Maybe we should go now," Claire whispered. She couldn't bear the thought of staying in this confined space, waiting for Megan to strike. They had to move, had to find some way out, even if it meant risking the darkness above. Olivia nodded shakily, but neither of them moved immediately. The terror of facing what waited outside the door paralyzed them both. Gathering her courage, Claire finally stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She motioned for Olivia to follow, and together they crept toward the door. Claire reached for the handle, her fingers brushing the cold metal, and hesitated. What if Megan was waiting on the other side? What if they opened the door and came face to face with the nightmare that had been chasing them? There was no other choice. Taking a deep breath, Claire twisted the knob and opened the door a crack. The hallway outside was dim, the faint light from the flickering bulb barely illuminating the space. But the hallway was empty. Claire let out a slow, shaky breath. "Come on," she whispered, pulling the door open wider. They stepped out into the hallway, the chill of the basement air clinging to their skin. The silence was unnerving, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Claire glanced back toward the stairwell, wondering if they could make it back up without drawing Megan's attention. But as they turned to leave, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence, a creak, like the groan of old wood being strained. Claire and Olivia froze in place, their eyes darting to the far end of the hallway. The shadows in the distance seemed to ripple and shift, moving of their own accord. Claire's heart dropped as she realized what was happening. The shadows were growing. Slowly, inch by inch, the darkness crept toward them, swallowing the light as it moved. Claire's pulse quickened as she watched the dark shapes twist and writhe along the walls, like something alive, something hunting them. "We have to go," Claire gasped, grabbing Olivia's arm. But before they could move, the shadows solidified into a shape, a figure. And there, standing at the end of the hallway, was Megan. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Her lips twisted into that same cruel smile, and she took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You didn't think you could leave me, did you?" Megan's voice was low, venomous. "You didn't think you'd get away with what you did?" Olivia let out a strangled sob, her body trembling as she clung to Claire. "Please, Megan," Olivia begged, her voice breaking. "We didn't mean for any of this to happen." But Megan's eyes darkened, her smile widening into something far more sinister. "It's too late for apologies," she hissed. "I'm not here for forgiveness. I'm here for you." Claire's entire body went numb with terror. There was nowhere to run. Megan was blocking the only exit, and her ghostly form was growing more solid with each passing moment. Claire turned to Olivia, her heart racing. "We have to run," she whispered urgently. "It's our only chance." But Olivia didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Megan, wide with fear. "We'll never make it," she whimpered. Megan took another step closer, her presence filling the hallway with a crushing sense of dread. Claire could feel the air growing colder, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. And then Megan lunged. Megan lunged, her pale, twisted figure moving with an unnatural speed. Claire barely had time to react as she grabbed Olivia's arm and yanked her backward, both of them stumbling into the narrow hallway. The cold air wrapped around them like icy fingers, freezing their breath as they bolted, their footsteps thudding loudly on the cracked concrete floor. "Run!" Claire screamed, pulling Olivia behind her. They sprinted down the hallway, but the space around them felt wrong, warped. The dim lights above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows, making the hallway appear to stretch infinitely. Each step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the darkness rather than toward escape. Megan's laughter echoed from behind them, a twisted, high-pitched sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It burrowed into Claire's mind, making her head spin. She dared not look back. She knew that if she saw Megan, the sight of her would paralyze her with fear. Olivia was sobbing, her breaths ragged and desperate. "We can't outrun her, we can't, we're going to die." Her words were broken, filled with hopelessness. She tripped over her own feet, but Claire held her up, refusing to let go. "We have to keep going," Claire shouted, though she wasn't sure how much longer they could. Her own legs felt like lead, her lungs burning from exertion. The hallway twisted and turned as if mocking them, offering no exit, only more darkness. Suddenly, Claire spotted a door ahead. It was barely visible in the flickering light, half hidden in the shadowy corridor. She didn't know where it led, but it didn't matter. It was the only way out. "There!" Claire pointed. "The door! Go!" They reached the door, and Claire slammed her body against it, praying it would open. With a loud creak, the door gave way, and they stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them. Claire fumbled with the lock, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely grasp the latch. For a moment, everything was quiet. Claire leaned against the door, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Olivia collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The cold air clung to them, but the suffocating presence of Megan had seemingly disappeared, for now. "We're safe," Claire panted, trying to convince herself as much as Olivia. "We're safe." But the words felt hollow. The room they had entered was unfamiliar, small and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb overhead. It looked like an old storage room, lined with shelves of forgotten dust-covered equipment and rusted tools. The walls were stained with mold, the air thick with the smell of damp decay. "We can't stay here," Olivia muttered, her voice barely a whisper. She was curled up on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. "She's not going to stop. She'll find us. She always finds us." Claire knelt beside Olivia, her mind racing. She knew Olivia was right. Megan wasn't just some vengeful spirit that they could run from. She was everywhere, watching, waiting. And no matter how many doors they slammed shut, Megan would always be just a step behind. "I don't know what to do," Claire admitted, her voice shaking. "But we can't give up. There has to be a way. There has to be." Olivia lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. "There's no way out. She's punishing us, Claire, for what we did." "We didn't mean for this to happen," Claire replied, though the guilt in her chest told her otherwise. "We were just kids playing a stupid prank. We didn't know." "We should have stopped," Olivia cried, her voice rising. "We knew she was fragile. We knew how scared she was. But we didn't stop, and now she's going to kill us, just like she killed the others." Claire's stomach twisted. Olivia's words cut through her like a blade, bringing back the images she had tried so hard to forget. Derek, Emily, Sam. They were all dead. Claire hadn't seen it happen, but she knew. Megan had taken them one by one, punishing them for the role they had played in her death. And now it was Claire and Olivia's turn. Suddenly the light bulb overhead flickered violently, casting the room into strobing flashes of darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on them like a weight. Claire's breath came in short gasps as she looked around the room, searching for any sign of movement. Then, from the shadows, the whisper came again. "You can't hide from me." The voice was soft, cold, and filled with malice. It curled around them like smoke, seeping into their minds, pulling at their deepest fears. Claire's heart pounded as she looked around the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, growing darker and more solid, as if something was pushing through them. And then, from the far corner of the room, Claire saw it, a figure, pale and distorted, slowly emerging from the darkness. Megan. Her eyes were wide and empty, her face twisted into an expression of pure rage. Her bony hands reached out toward them, fingers curled into claws. Her mouth twisted into that cruel smile, but this time it was even more grotesque, filled with a hunger for revenge. Olivia screamed, backing away from the figure, but there was nowhere to go. Claire felt her entire body go cold as she stared into Megan's hollow eyes, unable to move. It was as if the room itself had trapped them, locking them in with the ghost that had been hunting them. "You didn't stop," Megan hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally in the small space. You laughed while I begged for it to stop, and now it's your turn to beg." The lights flickered again, plunging the room into total darkness. For a moment, Claire couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and she could feel Megan's presence closing in on her, cold and relentless. Her skin prickled with fear, her mind spinning with panic. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the light flickered back on. Megan was gone. But Claire knew it wasn't over. It was never over. Olivia was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, her body trembling with terror. I can't do this anymore," she cried. "We're going to die, Claire." Claire knelt beside her, trying to steady her own shaking hands. "No," she said, though she didn't believe her own words. "We'll find a way. We just need to—" The light overhead flickered again, and Claire's words died in her throat. She stood up, her entire body tense as she listened for any sound, any sign of Megan's return. But the room was deathly silent. Then, with a loud crack, the light bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness once more. The room plunged into darkness, shards of glass from the shattered light bulbs scattering across the cold floor. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The oppressive blackness was suffocating, pressing down on her and Olivia as though the room itself were closing in. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was thick, broken only by Olivia's soft sobs as she crouched on the floor, her body trembling. Claire's mind raced. There had to be a way out. But the walls seemed to be closing in on them, the space growing tighter, more claustrophobic. "Claire!" Olivia whimpered, her voice barely audible. "She's here." Claire didn't need Olivia to say it. She could feel it, the icy chill in the air, the weight of Megan's presence. It was like a dark cloud hanging over them, creeping closer, ready to swallow them whole. Claire's fingers fumbled in the dark, searching for anything they could use to defend themselves or escape. But the room was empty except for the broken pieces of machinery and old, forgotten tools that littered the shelves. There was no way out. They had trapped themselves. The cold whisper came again, drifting through the blackness like a deadly lullaby. "You can't run from me. You can't hide." Claire's blood ran cold. The voice was closer now, far too close. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing Olivia's arm and pulling her up. "We need to go," Claire hissed, her voice tight with panic. "Now!" Olivia's sobs were uncontrollable, but she managed to stand, clutching Claire for support. They fumbled in the dark, moving blindly toward the door. Every step felt like they were walking into a nightmare, the cold air wrapping around them like tendrils, pulling them back into the heart of the darkness. Claire reached for the door, her fingers shaking as she grasped the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit basement hallway outside. But something was wrong. The space seemed distorted, twisted, like a funhouse mirror, warping reality around them. The hallway stretched endlessly, the flickering light barely illuminating the shifting shadows that danced along the walls. Claire's throat tightened with dread. They had no choice. They had to go forward, even if the hallway wasn't right. "Come on," Claire whispered, pulling Olivia with her as they stepped into the hallway. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to hide, but there was no going back now. They moved quickly, the cold air clinging to their skin like frost. The hallway twisted and warped as they walked, the walls seeming to bend and breathe around them. Claire's stomach churned with fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that Megan was close, watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, Olivia stopped in her tracks, her grip on Claire tightening painfully. "Claire," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "She's there." Claire turned, her heart lurching in her chest. At the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the flickering light, stood Megan. Her figure was twisted, her face pale and gaunt, eyes wide with fury. She was no longer the girl they had known. She was something else now, something dark and vengeful. Megan's smile twisted into something grotesque, her teeth bared like a predator about to strike. "You thought you could escape me?" Her voice was low, a hiss that seemed to fill the entire space. "After what you did, you'll never leave." Claire's heart pounded in her ears as she took a step back, her body trembling with fear. Olivia was frozen beside her, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. They couldn't run, not this time. Megan was everywhere, blocking every escape. "What do you want from us?" Claire cried, her voice shaking. "We didn't mean for any of this to happen." Megan's hollow eyes flickered with rage as she took a slow step forward. "You didn't stop. You laughed. You all laughed while I begged for it to stop." Claire's throat tightened with guilt. The memory of that day, the prank that had gone horribly wrong, rushed back to her like a tidal wave. They had pushed Megan too far, not realizing how fragile she truly was. They had never imagined it would end like this, but it had. "Megan, please," Olivia sobbed, sinking to her knees. "We're sorry. We never meant for you to die. We didn't know." Megan's face twisted with rage, her voice rising into a furious scream. "Sorry? You think you can be sorry now? It's too late." The lights in the hallway flickered violently, and the air around them grew impossibly cold. Claire felt her skin prickling with fear as the shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and contorting like living things. The dark energy in the air was suffocating, pressing down on them from all sides. Megan's figure seemed to grow larger, her presence more overwhelming as she stepped closer. The shadows stretched toward Claire and Olivia, creeping along the floor like fingers of darkness, reaching for them. "We're sorry," Claire shouted, her voice breaking. "Please, Megan, we didn't mean it. We were just stupid kids." But Megan didn't care. Her empty eyes bore into them, filled with nothing but rage and vengeance. "You'll feel what I felt," she whispered, her voice a twisted echo. "You'll know the pain I endured." Suddenly the shadows surged forward, enveloping Claire and Olivia. The cold was unbearable, like being submerged in ice water. Claire screamed as the darkness wrapped around her, pulling her down, suffocating her. She could feel the weight of Megan's hatred pressing into her chest, crushing her from the inside. Olivia was screaming too, her voice high-pitched and desperate. Claire reached out blindly, trying to grab her, but the shadows were too strong. They dragged Olivia into the darkness, her cries fading as the blackness swallowed her whole. "Olivia!" Claire screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. She thrashed against the shadows, but they clung to her like tar, pulling her deeper into the darkness. And then everything went still. The cold receded, the shadows disappeared, and Claire found herself standing alone in the hallway. The flickering light above her was steady again, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. But Olivia was gone. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she looked around, her mind spinning. The hallway was empty, silent. Megan was gone, but so was Olivia. "No," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no." She stumbled forward, her legs weak and trembling, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She had lost her friends. One by one, Megan had taken them. Derek, Emily, Sam, and now Olivia. And now Claire was alone. Suddenly, the cold whisper came again, soft and deadly. "You're next." Claire's heart stopped. She turned slowly, her body shaking with terror. There, at the end of the hallway, Megan stood once more, her smile wide and cruel, her eyes burning with hatred. The lights flickered again, and the darkness surged forward. The darkness surged toward Claire, swallowing the dim light of the hallway and dragging her into its depths. Her mind raced, her body frozen as she stood there, watching Megan's twisted figure move toward her. The temperature dropped sharply, and Claire's breath fogged in the frigid air. The weight of guilt, terror, and the overwhelming realization that she was truly alone pressed down on her, suffocating her. "Megan, please," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. She could barely speak through the lump of fear in her throat. "Don't do this." Megan's eyes glowed with an unearthly light, her face contorted into a monstrous grin. "You all laughed. You all watched me suffer. Now, it's your turn." Her voice was distorted, echoing from every corner of the hallway, surrounding Claire from all sides. Claire stumbled backward, the shadows creeping toward her like tendrils of darkness, reaching for her legs, her arms, pulling her toward the inevitable. Megan was no longer the scared girl they had once known. She had become something much darker, something filled with hatred and revenge, and Claire knew there was no escaping it now. She had lost everything, her friends, her sanity. She couldn't run anymore. But maybe she didn't have to. "No," Claire said, her voice shaky but louder than before. She stopped retreating, standing still in the hallway. She couldn't undo what had happened to Megan, the prank that had gone wrong, the laughter that had sealed their fate. But she could face it, face her. "I was wrong," Claire said, her heart racing, but her eyes locked on Megan's ghostly figure. "We were all wrong. I can't change what we did, and I can't bring you back. But I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it." Megan paused. For a moment, her twisted grin faltered, and the shadows around her seemed to hesitate. "I never meant for this to happen," Claire continued, her voice breaking. "None of us did. It was stupid and cruel, and I'll never be able to make up for what we did. But this isn't going to bring you peace. It's only making everything worse." Megan's eyes flickered, her hollow stare wavering for the briefest moment. The darkness that had surrounded her seemed to tremble, the shadows pulling back slightly. For the first time, Claire felt something other than terror, a sliver of hope. Maybe Megan wasn't too far gone. Maybe there was a way to end this nightmare, to finally give Megan the peace she had been denied in life. "Megan, you don't have to do this," Claire said softly, taking a tentative step forward. "I know you're angry. I know we hurt you. But it doesn't have to end like this. You deserve peace, not this endless hate. Let it go." Megan's face twitched, her expression flickering between rage and something else, something almost human. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, as though struggling to maintain their grip on her. For a brief moment, Claire thought she might have reached her. But then Megan's eyes darkened once more, and the twisted smile returned. "Peace," Megan hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "There is no peace for me, only pain. And now there will be pain for you." Before Claire could react, the shadows exploded toward her, enveloping her in an icy grip. She screamed as the cold darkness wrapped around her, pulling her to the ground, suffocating her. Megan's laughter echoed in her ears, cruel and unrelenting. Claire struggled against the shadows, her body writhing as the cold seeped into her bones. But no matter how hard she fought, the darkness tightened its grip, dragging her deeper into its embrace. Her vision blurred, the world around her spinning as she gasped for breath. Megan's face loomed above her, her hollow eyes filled with hatred. "This is where it ends, Claire," Megan whispered, her voice barely a breath. "You'll feel what I felt." The shadows pulled tighter, squeezing the life out of her, and Claire felt herself slipping away. Her chest tightened, her vision dimming as the cold consumed her. And then, just as Claire's body began to give in, something flickered in the darkness. A light, small, faint, but growing brighter. Claire's mind struggled to grasp what was happening. The light grew stronger, pushing back the shadows, illuminating the hallway in a soft, warm glow. Megan recoiled, her twisted smile faltering as the light pushed her back. The shadows around Claire loosened their grip, retreating in the face of the growing brightness. Claire gasped, filling her lungs with air as the suffocating darkness receded. The light, familiar, comforting, grew stronger, and Claire realized what it was: Megan's locket. The small silver locket that Megan had worn around her neck in life, the one that Claire had found in the dorm weeks after Megan's death. It had been a gift from Megan's mother, a reminder of happier times, and now it was glowing, casting its soft light over the hallway. Megan screamed, the sound filled with rage and pain as the light from the locket grew brighter. The shadows around her twisted violently, writhing as if in agony. "No, this isn't over. This will never be over." Claire reached for the locket, her hands shaking as she pulled it from her pocket. "I'm sorry, Megan," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's time to let go." The light from the locket flared, blinding in its intensity, and Megan let out one final, agonized scream. Her figure dissolved into the shadows, her twisted form vanishing as the light consumed the hallway. Then there was silence. The oppressive cold was gone, the shadows had disappeared, and Claire was left standing alone in the now empty hallway. The only sound was her own labored breathing, the locket's glow slowly fading in her hand. It was over. Claire collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face as the weight of everything crashed down on her. Her friends were gone. Derek, Sam, Emily, Olivia, all lost to the nightmare that had consumed them. But Megan was finally at peace. The locket, now dim, was the only reminder of her presence. Claire closed her eyes, clutching the locket tightly in her hand. The dormitory was silent, the halls still. The nightmare was finally over.